So what the heck is a developmental edit anyway? Let's find out. Hi there, my name is Katie Morgan. I am an indie fantasy author and fiction editor, and welcome to Bardic Fool's Editing Advice for Writers, the series where I talk about the ins and outs of getting feedback on your creative work and give you a little bit of insight into the editing process. So if you're not super familiar with professional editing, you might think that editing is just spelling and grammar, correcting those kinds of errors, but it actually encompasses a whole lot more. So today I'm going to walk you through a developmental edit. As you might remember from my Editing 101 video, developmental editing is the kind of big picture stuff, so character setting, world building, plot, those kinds of things. It's also my favorite kind of editing because it's where you can really dig into the meat of the story and help the writer create the story they're trying to tell. This particular kind of editing is so large in scope, I think it can be a little bit overwhelming, especially if you haven't worked with an editor in this particular kind of editing before. So the point of this video is to try to remove some of that mystery and get you a little bit more comfortable with what the developmental edit process looks like. So my developmental editing package includes a couple of different things. First, and perhaps most importantly, we've got that big picture feedback. So all of my reactions to things like character, plot, setting, all of those basic building blocks of a story. Additionally, we've got answers to specific author questions. So this is really important to me, to give authors a chance to ask right up front about maybe some specific feedback they need or to bring up some specific concern they have, so I can keep that in mind as I go through and make sure to answer those questions at the end. Then we've got inline comments. This means basically looking at a Microsoft Word document and turning on those track changes. So you've got comments down the side. This can be really helpful for immediate feedback related to a specific area. But that's not all, because we also have end of chapter comments. So this can be really helpful to see how one individual chapter or one individual segment plays. And finally, we've got the summary letter. This could be 5, 10, 15 pages, some really detailed commentary on what's working, what isn't, asking some questions, just trying to help move the project forward. So now we're going to jump into a screen share and I'll show you what all of this actually looks like. Okay, so for the first part of this screen share, I'm going to take you through how I do the inline comment portion of the developmental edit. So what you're looking at here on the screen is a somewhat early draft of my novel Dark Empathy, and I'm not going to go through like step by step, but I'm going to give you some highlights of what the inline commenting process would look like. So the first thing I would note if I were going through this as an editor is we're starting with a prologue. Now, I am definitely not one of those people who thinks all prologues are evil and you should never have one. However, I do think that it's worth noting when there is one and paying attention to what that does to the pacing and the overall structure of the story. So are we going to be getting information in this prologue that could be worked in later, or does it make sense that it would be upfront before we get to the main story? The other thing I might be looking at here is the opening line, or really the first couple of paragraphs. Does this pull you in? How does it establish the tone of the story? Here we're getting some introduction to some of the characters. Here's the introduction to the antagonist. How are these characters being introduced? Do we kind of understand what's going on? Do we want to keep reading? All of these things are things that I would be keeping in mind reading this through. So the other thing I would be doing here as I read through and, getting some of these reactions, I would probably be leaving, I wouldn't say they're necessarily comments for the author at this point, but I may be making notes to myself. This is good, or a question here. Notes to myself that I can come back to when I'm actually preparing this for the author to take a look at, so they have that inline reaction to various things. So I would read through the whole chapter like this, taking notes as I go. Once I get to the end of the chapter, that's when I would be doing that end of chapter note that I talked about previously. So I would just make a space here. I'd probably do this in a different font or color or something here to tell the author, hey, here's what I saw happening in this particular chapter. Here are some of the things that I was interested in or that I thought needed a little bit more explanation. Just a couple of sentences there to kind of give them an overall view of that particular chapter. As I move into the next chapter, what I would be looking for, again, are things that I think that might potentially trip up a reader or things that really jump out at me as we move from one portion of the text to another. So here we're into chapter 1. For example, we've got a time jump, so that would be something that I would be taking note of and seeing how that works. We're also moving on to a different point of view character, so I would also be looking at is there a real differentiation between this character and the previous one? And again, just looking at how do the different chapters flow into each other, and are there any particular things that stand out to me? And that would be basically the first read through. Once I've read through the whole manuscript, then I would go back to the beginning and take a look at the comments that I left and decide, do I still feel the same way having read the rest of the manuscript? Are there any things I can do to kind of clarify that feedback? Sometimes I think it's really helpful if I did have some confusion earlier on, even if it was resolved later, to make note of that. So even if my opinion changed based on what I read later on, the author can see, oh, here's how someone might be reacting to stuff at the beginning versus how they're reacting toward the end, and is that the kind of reaction that you want to have? Okay, so those are some of the inline comments I might be making and some of the thoughts I might be having as I go through the manuscript. And now we're going to jump into what a summary letter looks like, so you can see some of those more in-depth comments and the conversation that comes out of those. So now we're looking at a sample summary letter. This is actually something that I did end up doing for a client, but I've kind of broken it down into just the basics so we can kind of run through, generally speaking, what some of this might look like. So again, the summary letter is a separate document that I would send along with the original document with all the inline comments. The summary letter is an opportunity to talk a little bit more about some of the items that were brought up in the inline comments. And it's also a moment to kind of talk directly to the author, answer some of their questions, that kind of thing. To begin a summary letter, I always have some sort of section, a paragraph, a couple of sentences where I talk about what is really working with the piece. I think there's always something positive to say about any project, and I think particularly once you get to a summary letter, which is this really big, drawn out discussion of your work, it's really helpful to start with something that is positive. So I usually start there, and then I'll follow up with something explaining what the rest of the summary letter is going to look like. So basically saying, here's all the things that are working really well. Now I'm going to break down some of the questions that the author had, and also some of the details of what maybe we can work a little bit more on for the rest of the piece. So in this particular example, there were a couple of questions from the author, and those are the ones I tried to answer first. So in this case, we had some discussions about point of view, potentially adding in another point of view character. There were also some questions about the pacing of the story, and the author wanted to know about things related to clarity. So was it clear what was happening with individual scenes? Was the overall world building and storyline, did that all make sense? So the author questions are the ones that I try to answer first before I go into any other details. After I've answered the author's questions, I will then start breaking down some of those basic building blocks of the story. So here we start with characters, and I'll have a little bit of feedback on how I thought that worked. Next up, some setting, and with this one, I thought the author did a really great job with the setting, and I was sort of spitballing maybe some other things that they might do, building on that even more. Next up, world building and the powers. This particular piece was a fantasy piece, so I did have some questions about the main character's powers, how they worked, when they were active, when they were not active, and so I broke down some of those as well. So as I'm going through a manuscript, there are some things that are kind of universal elements that you might want to address. Things like we just looked at, like with character and the world building and that kind of thing. Occasionally there are things that I think are done particularly well with a particular piece, or they might be specific issues for this particular piece. So for example, in this piece, I had some questions about when information was revealed and how it was revealed, and so I talked a little bit about that. Why was the author making these particular choices about when they revealed something versus when they held something back? Are there ways to make choices about that that can affect sort of suspense or reader engagement? So in a developmental edit, while yes, we're talking about big picture stuff that is going to be universal, there are are also some things that are very specific to that piece that I will bring up as I go through these items. So you can see some other stuff here relating to the plot. Point of view, again, was something that this particular author had a lot of questions about. So in addition to mentioning it earlier, I also had a completely separate section where I broke down some more of those questions about potentially bringing in another point of view character and how that might work. And dialect was another situation, so something very specific to this piece, and dialect sort of traditionally is considered a really difficult thing to get right, and this piece did it really, really well. So I really wanted to make sure that I pointed that out, and I really wanted to make sure that the author knew that that was a thing that worked. I will finish up with some questions that I feel are remaining based on a reader perspective. So this is kind of a beta reader element, but I like to have it in the end because sometimes you want to leave the reader with questions and other times you don't want to do that. And it's really important as a writer to know which one you're actually going for. So I like to point out at the end, here are some questions I still had, so that the writer can see, oh, those are the questions I wanted you to have, or, oh no, I really need to resolve some of this stuff a little earlier on. And then we do the final thoughts, and this is kind of a summation of everything that I was writing about earlier, probably a little bit about some of the things that I brought up in the inline comments as well. I really want to focus hard on the stuff that's working well, at the same time that I'm bringing up some areas for possible improvement. And I always have some sort of concluding paragraph noting that, hey, if you have any questions or you need any kind of elaboration, definitely contact me. Here's how you would do that. I'm excited to see where this piece goes. And that's a summary letter. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what a developmental edit looks like. As you can see, you can get a lot of really good actionable feedback from this kind of edit. That's it for this episode of Bardic Fool's Editing Advice for Writers. I hope that was helpful. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more on the editing and creative process. I've actually got a link to my editing page down below in the description if you're curious to know more about how this process might look for your writing. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.